Thank you all for coming. We have in the audience a lot of museum members. I want to thank you for coming today and for all you do to support the museum. And we have a lot of our friends from the Polish community, and we're very glad to have you back in this institution. It's great that we're doing this program this year because this year, actually, we will celebrate the museum's 20th anniversary. And as it happens, our longest-standing partnership, a partnership that predates the opening of our museum, is with Poland. Its government, its sites of memory, and its many professionals who, like us, are dedicated to Holocaust remembrance and education. And today's program is just another example of that wonderful partnership. And as you all know, Poland is not only the site of the 6 German killing centers, but during the war, Poland endured uniquely horrific losses of both its Jewish and non-Jewish citizens. Half of the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust were Polish. And for those of you in the audience, many of you I'm sure have family members who experienced the Holocaust or were killed in the Holocaust, or who were concentration camp inmates, slave laborers, or other victims of Nazi persecution. And I wanted to let you know, you might have seen this brochure outside, that the museum has extensive archives with names of individuals who suffered Nazi persecution, and please contact us so we can do research and help you learn more about their fates. As we know, 90% of Poland's Jews were killed during the Holocaust. But those who survived, those few who survived, mostly did so because they were helped. And in fact, Poland has more rescuers than any other country, over 6,300. Who were those extraordinary individuals who risked their lives to save a fellow human being? Well, one of them was the mother of our first speaker, the Polish ambassador, Richard Schneff. Ambassador Schneff is not only the son of an exceptional woman, but an old friend of this institution. He has had a distinguished career in public service in Poland for about 2 decades now, having served most recently as Poland's ambassador to Spain and the Undersecretary of State at the Foreign Ministry. But in this institution, he holds another very valued title, for in addition to being a friend, he is a historian, sharing our conviction that if you really care about the future, you must know about the past. Ambassador Schneff.
Dear event co-hosts, Ms. Sarah Bloomfield, distinguished guests, and esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen. I was offered only 3 minutes to talk today, but believe me, to speak about Witold Pilecki, it's not easy to be short, to be brief. So if I extend a little bit, please forgive me. First, a big thanks to Director Bloomfield for your excellent remarks, and as well as for hosting this event in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on this special day. I also would like to thank you for your special words toward my person. I definitely don't deserve them, but I do my best as Polish ambassador that at the end of the mission you would repeat the same words. I am confident that the experts we will hear from today will shed some valuable insight into Captain Witold Pilecki's extraordinary personality and the story of his volunteering for capture and imprisonment in Auschwitz. As all nations, we have in our history ashes and diamonds. Today we will meet one of the most brilliant diamonds that we ever had in our history. Witold Pilecki's story is an example of the heroism and sacrifice that connect the tragic fates of Poles and Jews during the years of World War II. That becomes evident when you look at the images on the screen behind me. First, Pilecki as a Polish army officer, then in his concentration camp uniform. The first image underlines the fact that Pilecki's imprisonment in Auschwitz was not his personal endeavor. He went to Auschwitz on a mission set up and run by Poland's underground, which later evolved into the Polish Home Army, the largest resistance movement in all of Europe. The photograph of Pilecki in his Auschwitz uniform is instantly recognizable to each survivor of the notorious German Nazi camp established in 1940 for Poles caught in a wave of mass arrests and prosecutions. 2 years later, Auschwitz-Birkenau was the largest Nazi death camp, receiving trainloads of Poles, Soviet war prisoners, guerrilla fighters, and Jews from all over Europe. Eventually, it was designated as the main camp of the extermination of Jews, which made it inextricably linked to Jewish memory of the Holocaust. Pilecki's bravery and courage are extraordinary. He was not only a Polish officer, but also a husband and father of two. Yet, he undertook his risky and compromised mission for a goal larger than himself, taking the righteous action at a time when resistance to the Nazis was punished by death. In 1945, he wrote the following, which still rings true today. There is always a difference between saying you will do something and actually doing it. A long time before, many years before, I had worked on myself in order to be able to fuse these two, Pilecki wrote. The information Pilecki gathered in his almost 3 years at Auschwitz was passed on by Poland's underground to its Western allies. It was largely disregarded and certainly not acted upon. After the war's end, Pilecki was given a show trial by the newly established communist regime in Poland. He was convicted and shot in the back of the head, branded a traitor to his country who worked for foreign imperialism. Today, we see Pilecki as the highest example of Polish patriotism, bravery, and perseverance against powerful enemies. I am deeply convinced that we owe him our remembrance and acknowledgement, both as Poles and as Jews. And I think that there could be hardly a better place to commemorate him than the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, whose mission is to inspire citizens and leaders worldwide to confront hatred, prevent genocide, and promote human dignity. Pilecki was a living witness to all these ideals, and ultimately paid the highest price for speaking the truth. As the ambassador of Poland, I feel happy and honored that Witold Pilecki today joins Jan Karski, Władysław Bartoszewski, and numerous other righteous among the nations on the list of Poles commemorated in this museum. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Witamy. My name is Dr. Edna Friedberg. Welcome. I guess you couldn't hear me before. Witamy. I'm a historian here at the Holocaust Museum, and joining us today are Dr. Timothy Snyder, who is the Hausum Professor at Yale University of History, who is the author of 5 award-winning books, including The Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, 1569 to 1999, And in 2010, Dr. Snyder published Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Connection to our program today, he also wrote the New York Times book review of The Auschwitz Volunteer, Beyond Bravery. This museum is also pleased to have Dr. Snyder as a member of our Committee on Conscience, whose mandate is to alert the national conscience, influence policymakers, and stimulate worldwide action to confront and work to halt acts of genocide or related crimes against humanity. Welcome, Dr. Snyder.
Thank you.
We are also very pleased to welcome, having traveled from far away, Dr. Piotr Setkiewicz, the head of the research department at the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum in Poland. Dr. Setkiewicz earned his doctorate for a dissertation on the I.G. Farben work at Auschwitz, 1941 to 45. He began working for the Auschwitz Museum in 1988, where he eventually served as head of the archives, later becoming head of the research department in 2008. Dr. Setkiewicz's research interests include the employment of prisoners in German industry and the history of the Auschwitz subcamps. Welcome, Dr. Setkiewicz. I would like to reiterate Sarah Bloomfield's thank you to the Embassy of the Republic of Poland and to Ambassador Schnepp. We are gathered here today on a most significant date, for today is January 27th, which marks the 68th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp and killing center, and I can think of no better subject with which to mark this occasion. We are also here to acknowledge the publication for the first time in English of an extraordinary historical document, a first-hand account of life in what has been described as hell on earth, written by a true hero, Polish Army Captain Witold Pilecki. And it is thanks to the work of translator Jarek Garlinski, who I'm pleased to say is with us today, that for the first time this report can be read by an English-speaking audience. Captain Witold Pilecki was a man of deep principle. He was a passionate Polish patriot, a Catholic, and an unwavering opponent of totalitarianism in all forms, who would eventually pay with his life. For context, during World War II, the German occupation of Poland was exceptionally brutal. The occupation authorities sought to destroy Polish culture by physically annihilating members of the political, religious, and intellectual elites. Between 1939 and 1945, the Germans and their collaborators murdered almost 5 million Polish civilians, of whom 3 million were Jewish. German authorities also deported at least 1.5 million Polish citizens as forced laborers to German territory and imprisoned hundreds of thousands of Poles in concentration camps. It was in this context and that of Soviet occupation that Witold Pilecki repeatedly risked his life in defense of his country and his ideals. With that background, I would like to turn to our guests and begin our conversation. Dr. Setkiewicz, would you please tell us when and how you first heard the name Witold Pilecki?
When it was when I began my work in the museum, when I met for the first time some of my older friends, researchers in the museum, namely Mr. Adam Cyra, and of course, shortly thereafter, there was Mr. Józef Garlinski, who was author of the famous book in Poland, Fighting Auschwitz. It was a story of the military organization led by Lieutenant Witold Pilecki in the Auschwitz concentration camp. That was for the first time when I heard about it.
And Pilecki, he himself came from a long line of Polish nationalists. Is that not true?
Yeah, but well, for many years, his story was not known in Poland, and it was practically only in the beginning of the 90s when it became more popular. Now you can find many information about him in the media, in books, in albums, movies. So now he's considered one of the most important heroes of the Polish Second World War history.
As far as you know, is Pilecki the only person to have volunteered to enter Auschwitz?
Yes, as far as I know, no one else ever tried to do the same.
Now, to set the stage, I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Snyder, and help our audience to understand the context of Poland during this period. Tell them a little bit about how young the modern state of Poland was, how it came into being, and forces at work in the late 1930s when the war began.
Mm-hmm. So to understand the life of someone like Witold Pilecki, who was a Polish army officer, one has to have a sense of how Poland came to be and what Poland was threatened by and how Poland was finally destroyed. Poland came to be in 1918 as a result of the destruction of the three empires which had partitioned Poland more than 100 years before. As a result of the First World War, Germany was defeated, Austria fell apart, and the Russian Empire broke apart and then became slowly the Soviet Union. It was in this interval that an independent Poland could be created. Now, these origins are important because these origins involved fighting against many enemies at once. Pilecki, for example, fought in 1919 and 1920 in an often forgotten war, the Polish Bolshevik War, which was this decisive war for establishing Polish independence. When Poland was established, it was as a republic of and for the Polish nation, but which had very large national minorities. The largest national minority were the Ukrainians, around 5 million, then the Jews, around 3 million, Belarusians, about 1 million, Germans, almost 1 million. So Poland was, in fact, a multinational state. About 10% of the population was Jewish. In the larger cities, Warsaw, Łódź, a third of the population was Jewish. In the cities in the eastern half of the country, often a plurality or even a majority of the population was Jewish. Poland was, in effect, the largest, the most significant Jewish country in the world at the time. There were as many Jews in Łódź, which many of you may not have heard of, as there were in Palestine in the 1930s. So when Poland was destroyed in 1939, what was destroyed? What was destroyed? This multinational state, and Poles and Jews and Ukrainians alike found themselves without a state. And how was it destroyed? It was destroyed by a simultaneous invasion from the west by the German army, the Wehrmacht, and from the east by the Soviet army, the Red Army. So people like Pilecki, who were from the east and who were used to seeing the Soviets as the main enemy, suddenly found themselves confronting two enemies, both of which were determined to destroy the Polish state.
So Poland is caught between two murderous regimes. If we could back up for a minute and you could explain to the audience about the alliance into which Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Union entered in August 1939 and what their plans were for Poland.
Mm-hmm. So the difficulty with the First World War is that we tend to begin the First World War at the moment which is most beneficial for us, depending upon our own national orientation. So for the Soviets, the Second World War often begins in 1941 because that's when the Germans attacked the Soviets. For Americans, it often begins in December 1941 because that's when the Japanese attacked us. But in fact, the Second World War begins in September 1939, and it begins in a very curious way. It begins with an alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, an alliance according to which the two of them divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence and then occupied those spheres of influence. Germany taking Western and Central Poland, and the Soviet Union, the Baltic states, as well as Eastern Poland. So the Second World War begins as with an alliance and a joint attack between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union.
If I could turn to you, Dr. Setkevich, with this context of Nazi Germany coming from the West and the Soviets from the East, when does Auschwitz become part of this story? When was the first Auschwitz camp built, and for what purpose?
Auschwitz was built, was organized on the site of a former Polish military base. It was in June 1940, originally built for Polish political prisoners. And the first transport of Polish prisoners were sent from local jails in southern Poland, from Tarnów, from Silesia, from Krakow. So these people constitute the vast majority of Auschwitz prisoners in 1940. There were some German prisoners, mostly criminals, and also a few Jews. About 300-400 Jews were brought to Auschwitz in 1940, but they almost immediately after the registration in the camps, they were sent to the punishment company, when the mortality rate was extremely high, and reached, in the case of Jewish prisoners, approximately 90%, comparing to the average mortality among the Polish prisoners, it was about 50%. And the same situation prevailed in 1941. It was over 1,200 Jewish prisoners brought to Auschwitz, and mortality among them reached about 85%.
If I could interrupt for a minute, could you explain to our audience the causes of these deaths? Were these people being actively murdered? Were they dying as a result of conditions? Describe a little more the physical state and policies.
Mostly they were, the death was a result of an extremely brutal treatment from the side of the guards, the soldiers, as well as the capos. In this punishment company, there were many so-called green functionary prisoners, who received green triangles, were Germans and who used to kill Jewish prisoners usually after 2, 3, 5 days of their stay in this working detail.
And when you say green triangle, you mean the badge on their prisoner uniform.
They have the green
identified them
badges, yeah.
as part of the hierarchy. If we could actually go back a slide, please. This slide actually is from September 1939, and I wanted to have it up when we're moving back to our story of Pilecki, simply because it shows destruction in Warsaw. This is after a German air raid bombardment in 1939. This photo, by the way, which I think is very striking, is part of a very horrifyingly beautiful series of photos taken by an American photographer, Julian Bryan, and can be found in the museum's collections. You can look at it on our website as well. I wanted to put it up because Pilecki, during this first year of the war, is in and around Warsaw. And when he enters or volunteers to be rounded up, he is not acting alone. He is part of a broader network of Polish underground resistance. Could you tell us something about that resistance?
Sure. So one of the things which is touching about this picture is that it's Warsaw, which is simultaneously a Polish city and a Jewish city. The bombardment of Warsaw was the first large-scale bombardment of civilian targets from the air in the history of the world. We remember later incidents like Dresden, but the first one in the history of the world was the Luftwaffe's bombing of Warsaw. Never before had a major city been bombed in this way. Something like 25,000 people were killed in the bombardment, which was a horrifying total at the time, and even I think for us, I mean, it's half of Hiroshima, if you think about it. And those casualties were divided rather evenly between Poles and Jews. And for many Poles and Jews, the destruction of Warsaw from the very beginning would be a kind of symbol. And the destruction of the city progresses as the war goes on. The ghetto will be burned down. The entire city will be burned down. We'll get to all of that. Pilecki was a soldier. He fought in the Polish army. His platoon was dissolved only 2 weeks after the fighting was over, and he joined the Polish underground. The Polish underground were not partisans. They regarded themselves, and they were in fact, the continuation of the legally constituted and existing Polish army. The Polish government went into exile, Romania, France, later in London. It had 2 major branches of its armed forces, and one was the unit which came to be called the Home Army inside Poland. Pilecki was working for them. Now, I'm talking about resistance at a time when Poland's main army has been overcome, when the state has been destroyed, and when the Germans have set about trying to physically eliminate educated Poles who might possibly reconstitute the state. One of the ways they're going about this is that they're sending people to concentration camps, one of which was Auschwitz. So Auschwitz was familiar to people like Pilecki because precisely Auschwitz had been a Polish military base. It was a Polish military barracks under the name Oświęcim. But people were starting to disappear, first from Silesia and then from the summer of 1940 into Auschwitz. And Pilecki volunteered as a member, as an officer within this underground army to go and to see what was happening.
What was the goal of his mission? For either of you, you can answer.
The main goal was, of course, to organize the core of the secret organization in the camp, and then to prepare for possible uprising or the cooperation with the partisans that should act on behalf of these prisoners. Then to send messages about the situation in the camp, primarily to the Polish headquarters of the Home Army in Warsaw, and then prepare the possible fight against Germans, particularly in case of, as the person suspected, that it was quite possible that one day the SS would decide to liquidate the camp. So that might be the moment when the prisoners should fight and to perhaps also to escape from the camp, to organize massive escapes or many individual escapes. These were the fields of his activity in Auschwitz.
So he had multiple goals. There was an intelligence goal, and there was also preparing for future action, depending on the course of the war or what was possible.
If I could just jump in there, Edna.
Please.
Later on, one of the questions that so many of us have asked is, why didn't the Allies bomb Auschwitz? Why didn't that happen? Pilecki was one of the very first, if not the first person to begin that particular line of complaint, because one of the contingencies for an uprising in Auschwitz would have been precisely a serious bombing of the facility. So Pilecki was hoping that either the Polish resistance would choose to attack, or the Allies would choose to attack Auschwitz, neither of which, of course, happened.
So I think what we're getting here through both of your answers is also a sense of interconnectedness, the interconnectedness of ethnic dynamics within pre-war Poland with the way that resistance unfolded during the war, the interconnectedness of the Nazi assault on civilian Poland with its network of concentration camps, and the interconnectedness of resistance movements inside and outside camps. So we have a larger web of activity as opposed to an isolated story. We could go ahead and advance the slide, please. Actually, 2 slides. Yeah. I wanted to show this picture of Witold Pilecki with his wife and one of his 2 children in order to give us a sense that this was a man who had a lot to lose. At the time that he volunteered for this highly dangerous mission from which he had a good expectation that he would not return, he was married with 2 young children, and he was not acting alone neither in the resistance nor in his risks. Since we are here also to talk in the context of the report being published in English, I thought we should read a few lines in Pilecki's words himself. Thank you to Jarek Garlinsky for this translation. Here he describes his arrival at Auschwitz. Quote, "I bade farewell to everything I had hitherto known on this earth and entered something seemingly no longer of it. We were struck over the head not only by SS rifle butts, but also by something far greater. Our concepts of law and order and of what was normal, all those ideas to which we had become accustomed on this earth, were given a brutal kicking. Everything came to an end." Now let's help our audience understand, how did this go from a plan to actually entering Auschwitz? How did he get from Warsaw to Auschwitz? Either of you.
So he made his way to a roundup. People were rounded up. He made his way to a roundup. The details are slightly unclear, but he got himself into a situation where he would be rounded up with others and take it to a transit point, and from there to Auschwitz. And he had moments of hesitation. He could see, being a rather intelligent, physically capable man, he could see various places where he might have escaped along the way. And he willed himself not to escape. He willed himself all the way into Auschwitz. And I think this is a point worth pausing upon, because one could think of the impulsive courage of saying to someone, "Oh yes, I will volunteer to go to Auschwitz." One can perhaps imagine the impulsive courage of actually getting oneself into that roundup, but staying the course and actually going there and arriving and seeing what it was, and then remaining for almost 3 years. That describes an entirely different kind of courage from a rather special sort of individual.
It's quite probable that in the same roundup in which Pilecki was arrested, was also arrested Władysław Bartoszewski, whom the museum will be honoring in April with our highest honor, the Elie Wiesel Award. So again, multiple connections. Dr. Setkevich, what could Pilecki and his comrades in the Home Army have known about what was going on in Auschwitz at the time? Where do you think he thought he was going?
I think that at this particular moment it was very little. I mean, uh, when Pilecki was arrested, the population of Auschwitz reached about 2,000, a little bit more than 2,000 prisoners. And there were no any contacts and links between the prisoners of the concentration camp and the outside world. But it was...
Let me interrupt you for 1 second. At its peak, what is the prisoner population of Auschwitz later in the war, just to give a sense of scale?
Okay, in the end of 1940, it was about 7,000 people. In 1943, about 70,000. In 1944, 140,000. In all branches of the Auschwitz complex. So you can see, initially, Auschwitz was a camp that might be compared at this moment with many other camps in Germany, like Sachsenhausen, like Mauthausen, was not the biggest one.
Okay, thank you. Just wanted that context.
For the first time, people in Warsaw learned something about Auschwitz when the first transport from Auschwitz was brought, from Warsaw was brought to Auschwitz, and these people began to die. And the families in Warsaw began to receive the telegrams from the commander of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, informing that your husband died in Auschwitz. So people suddenly realized there's something going horrible on in Auschwitz, and that was why that was a need to obtain more information about Auschwitz. So that was the role of Pilecki.
So word did get back. It's not as though Auschwitz at this point was some sort of black hole into which a prisoner would just disappear. Families did hear. Pilecki was put to work as a forced laborer. Could you tell us something about what daily life would have been like for him and his fellow prisoners in this period, 1940, 41?
So for him, and many others from this transport, the most important thing was to find a good work. Work, as it was called in Auschwitz, under the roof, in the so-called better commandos, better working squads. But initially had to pass through all these procedures as registration, as receiving new clothes, prisoner clothes, new clocks, wooden clocks, and to live together with other prisoners in the barracks of Auschwitz camp. He was also the target of the brutality of the German capos, the block seniors. So his situation on the very beginning was identical, the same as thousands of other prisoners. But because he was still young, because he had certain contacts with the prisoners who reached Auschwitz earlier, I mean, there were also non-commissioned officers of the Polish army. So thanks to these links, these contacts with these people, was able to receive better jobs in the camp. For instance, for a couple of months, he worked as a carpenter in a certain shop that was located under the roof, a certain distance from Auschwitz. So it was a good job, good post to survive. And that was probably the reason why all these people who managed to survive the first initial months in Auschwitz, they were able to do so because they have colleagues, they have certain contacts in the camp, and they finally received a better job.
So the hierarchy within the prisoner population in Auschwitz was not only established by the Germans, but also by connections, who you knew, where you fit into the social environment.
It was quite natural. There were many cases when, for instance, a head of certain workshop was from Krakow, and he tried to collect with him the people who also brought from Krakow, something like that, or particularly officers of the army, or students, or members of this resistance organization that existed in Poland at this time. So they were able to find the colleagues, the friends among the newly arrivals, and organized for them the better jobs.
The slide that we have up now, just so you know what you're looking at, is a picture of forced laborers in the constellation of Auschwitz camp working in a factory run for the Siemens Corporation. If we could go to the next slide, please. Actually, let's go back to, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. Just want to read you again a few lines in Pilecki's words himself about the conditions of work in the camp, and obviously this is perhaps the most iconic, or one of the most iconic images of Auschwitz, the Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free gate. These are Pilecki's words translated. Carrying bricks back to camp, I sometimes lost consciousness and walked as if in a trance. I could see spots. It would not have taken much for me to stumble. Then I continued, urged on by willpower alone. I entered the camp gate. Now I understood the sign over the gate, Arbeit macht frei. Oh, indeed, work sets you free of consciousness, sets the soul free of the body, sending that body to the crematorium. Now, in June 1941, obviously, the course of World War II changed dramatically. Could you tell us about that, please, Dr. Snyder?
Mm-hmm. So, from Pilecki's point of view, inside Auschwitz, one actually has a perspective on the entire war. The history of Auschwitz is the history of the war. What the Germans were trying to do in Auschwitz, who their main enemies were, depended upon the stage of the war. When Pilecki comes into Auschwitz in 1940, the main enemy is the Pole, especially the Polish educated class. In the summer of 1941, this changes. On the 22nd of June 1941, the Germans betray their Soviet ally and invade the Soviet Union in the largest scale invasion in the history of the world, along with 4 or 5 allies. They begin what they consider a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union, attempting to destroy the Soviet political class as they tried to destroy the Polish political class, but considering as an essential part of the Polish political class the Jewish population. So with the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941 begins for the first time the deliberate mass murder of European Jews. And from this point forward, the history of the war changes. In Auschwitz, for a brief moment, the main enemy will be Soviet prisoners of war. We forget about Soviet prisoners of war because no one chooses to remember them. But they were the second largest victim after the Jews of German policy. Some 3 million Soviet prisoners of war were killed. And some of them were those men, and Pilecki writes about this, some of them were the men who were test gassed, who were gassed as experimental victims in Auschwitz. So for a moment, the Soviet prisoners of war, the Soviets, were the main victim. But with time, as the war against the Soviet Union continued, the Jews became the main victim. And this is visible inside Auschwitz as it's visible in Europe as a whole.
Let's talk a little bit about the resistance movements within Auschwitz, please, Dr. Sedkevich. And I intentionally used the plural form, for there were many different ideological strands. Could you describe that for us, please?
Well, from the very beginning, it was the Pilecki's organization was the first one that emerged in Auschwitz, but there were some other smaller groups that were formed by other officers of the Polish army. But in the course of time, they united into the one major organization that might be considered as the military. I mean, it was composed mostly on members of the Polish organizations. It was based on the officers of the army, but also students, officials, so members of so-called intelligentsia. So these were the people who felt subordinate to the Polish government in exile in London and who believed that the leadership of the organization is in Warsaw, namely it was the headquarters of the Home Army. So when the one group, one part of the Auschwitz conspiracy. Another one was formed by the activists, by the politicians, members of different political parties. Mostly they were socialists, but they began to play a more important role in the second half of 1942, with the arrival of the leaders of the organizations to the camp, when these people were able to constitute, make links with the outside world, with the local organization of a Polish Socialist Party in Brześć, in Oświęcim, and other places. So that was another stream of the Polish conspiracy, but of course, with the arrival of prisoners from different countries, mainly Jews, there were also many smaller groups in Auschwitz, and there was also a small organization led by the communists.
And just as the resistance movement in Poland during the war has connections to organizational structures from before the war, these structures in Auschwitz have later reverberations as well. For example, Cyrankiewicz, who later is premier in communist Poland, was active in resistance within Auschwitz, right?
So Mr. Cyrankiewicz was not a communist at this moment, but still a prominent socialist activist from Krakow. He was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. He became one of the leading figures in this socialist movement. Nevertheless, in the course of time, it became clear for all these leaders of the smaller groups that it would be necessary to coordinate their efforts, and it led in consequence to the formation of so-called Kampfgruppe Auschwitz. It was Fighting Unit Auschwitz. That was done in order to consolidate the resistance movement in the whole camp, and to prepare for the future fight, particularly in this later period, when it became clear that Germans are committing horrible crimes, gas chambers, crematoria in Birkenau. So most people in the camp, most prisoners did not believe that the Auschwitz would be liberated. They believed rather that the Germans, at the very end, they would try to kill the prisoners, all the prisoners in the camp, and to destroy the barracks. So that was probably the reason why all these organizations decided to unify somehow, but it was only in 1944 practically.
So that they could, yes.
One of the reasons that the Pilecki story has taken so long to get to us has to do with the attempt to monopolize resistance. So there were, looking at Auschwitz, but also looking more broadly at the camps and at resistance to the Germans in general, there were two major political ideas behind underground resistance to Nazi occupation. In Europe as a whole, two ideas that actually had significance in politics. The first was communism in the camps in Ukraine, in Belarus, and Yugoslavia. And the second was Polish patriotism in the camps in Poland and in the Polish armies that fought in Western and Southern Europe. Those were the two main political ideas that brought about resistance. But they don't talk about each other. So Pilecki is not going to write about communists, and communists are certainly not going to write about Pilecki. And this is very important to think when we try to understand what happened to this story later on. Because later on, when the communists will be in power in Poland, every example of resistance, Polish resistance and Jewish resistance, for example, the ghetto uprising, will be turned into a story of working class resistance and communist resistance. And if it doesn't fit that story, it will be eliminated from history. So the fact that resistance was plural, but that the post-war world was not, is very important for understanding what comes down and what doesn't come down.
Absolutely, and it's part of the reason, it is the reason, that Pilecki's report is suppressed for so many decades, because he does not fit into this communist narrative, this communist prism for viewing the war and resistance. If we can go to the slide with the three faces, please. I'd like to take us into 1942, where we see another major shift in the prisoner population of Auschwitz. Thank you. These are pictures of Jewish girl, Jewish man, and Jewish woman, each of whom were deported to Auschwitz in 1942. Could you tell us a little bit about the ways, Dr. Setkevich, that the prisoner population at the camp changed during this period and why?
Well, it was after Wannsee conference and
The Wannsee Conference.
yeah, at the moment where Nazi authorities decided to solve the Jewish problem on a smaller scale in southern Poland, when the decision was taken to organize the new camp in Birkenau and to build the extermination facilities like gas chambers, crematories there. So when in 1940-41, the number of Jews in the camp constituted approximately 3-5% of the overall population. So from this time on, from the spring of 1942, with the arrival of the first mass transport of Jews, the number of Jews suddenly reached 50-60% of prisoners, those prisoners who were registered. And of course, the masses of Jews were murdered without being even entered into the camp records. They were murdered immediately. So from a formal point of view, from the Nazi point of view, they were not prisoners at all. They were murdered just a few hours or quarters after the arrival to the camp. But it was a dramatic change in the history of Auschwitz and a completely new chapter in the history of the camp. So from this time, Auschwitz became not only the concentration camp, horrible concentration camp for Poles, but also a death camp for Jews.
Here's how Pilecki describes this period of time, and I quote, the transports kept coming and coming. The vast majority of transports went straight to Birkenau, where people, without being processed, were quickly turned into smoke and ash. Who was going into the jaws of death, and why? They were Jews from France, Czechoslovakia, Holland, and other European countries. And he goes on to describe details of the killing process that he gleaned from brief conversations with Jewish prisoners who were part of the Sonderkommando, who helped to process prisoners and their belongings. And in total, approximately 1.1 million Jews were deported to Auschwitz over the course of the Holocaust. Let's move on in our story because we have a lot to cover. Dr. Setkevich, can you tell us how and when Pilecki escaped from Auschwitz?
Well, he escaped after about a year after the arrival of the first mass transport of Jews to Auschwitz. It was in April 1943. That might be interesting to find out what was the reasons why he decided to do so. Because, in my opinion, because he was confronted with two factors. First of all, he found out that practically nobody in Warsaw, nobody among the leadership, in the leadership of the Polish resistance, believed that any action towards the liberation of the camp be possible.
So in a way, part of his mission was dashed.
He realized that no one, not only in Warsaw, but also the Allies were not able to do something to liberate the camp, to bomb the camp, for instance. So that was the one reason. The second was that more or less at the same time, in the spring of 1943, the Nazi authorities at Auschwitz decided to transfer all these older prisoners, so-called low numbers, from Auschwitz to the other camps in the Reich, to Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, Dachau, and others. So he could see what was going on with his organization. Gradually, the people disappeared, being taken with this transport from Auschwitz to Dachau, for instance. So he found his mission that comes to the end. And it was why he decided to escape, particularly because he knew at this time that the Germans not punished the families of escapees or the friends from the other commandos. So that was why he decided to to escape and to go to Warsaw and to tell again the story to the leaders of the Polish underground.
So how did he escape?
Well, it was a bit complicated. He organized initially his transfer, his and two other colleagues. There was a bakery which was situated between the both major camps, between Auschwitz I and between Birkenau.
And transfer is, and that was his workstation now.
Yeah, and so this bakery worked on 2 shifts, daily and night shift. So he arranged his transfer for the night shift, and then he, together with his colleagues, they broke through the doors, and then he managed to cross the territory around the camp. It was heavily guarded by the Germans, and then finally he reached Nowe Wiśniczyce locality about 100 kilometers from Auschwitz.
And did he escape alone?
With two other colleagues from of course, Polish, also Polish political prisoners and members of his organization.
If we could please pull up the slide with the document. This is a document from our collection. It's not that clear here, but it's a telegram signed by Rudolf Hess, who was the German commandant of Auschwitz, describing the escape of prisoners, including the name, and we should have mentioned at the beginning that when Pilecki was in the camp and in the roundup, he was there under an alias, under a code name of Tomasz Serafiński. So this lists by name that Tomasz Serafiński and others have escaped from the camp and the date, and this is available in our archive. I've also been asked to alert you we are having time for a few more questions, but then we will be having time for audience questions. When you entered the theater, you should have received an index card. If you would write any questions that you have for Dr. Snyder or Dr. Sitkevich on the index card, staff members will be coming through the aisles to collect those in about 10 minutes. If I could turn to you, Dr. Snyder, and ask you what happened to Pilecki later, after he escapes Auschwitz. If you could tell us a little bit about the Warsaw Uprising of 1944.
Mm-hmm. So for Pilecki, it's important to understand that for him, everything he did had the same meaning. It was part of the same story. It was all on behalf of his notion of what Poland should be. It was all an expression, as he saw things, of Polish honor, a defense of Poland, which was both physical and metaphysical. He went back into the underground. He occupied himself for a while with other prisoners who had escaped from Auschwitz. He rejoined the Polish resistance, which by this time was called the Home Army. And when a decisive moment came in the summer of 1944, when the Polish Home Army took the fateful decision to try to liberate Warsaw from the Germans, Pilecki took an important part. And in this, and in many other things, he was humble. He didn't tell other people who he was. He didn't even initially, I don't think, take up an officer's command, although eventually he did. And he played a very significant role in the Warsaw Uprising. He defended an important juncture in downtown Warsaw. And he became famous for many people simply as a soldier during the Warsaw Uprising. In fact, for a long time, there were many people who knew him mainly in that connection. He was remembered mainly in that connection. But the Warsaw Uprising was itself an example of horrifying German repression and also an example of Poland's position between German and Soviet power. The reason why the Polish Home Army decided to try to liberate the city was that they thought there was a moment between when the Germans were falling back and when the Red Army arrived. Remember, this entire time, if you're Polish, you're trying to imagine how the country can be liberated not just from the Germans, the present occupier, but the Soviets, the future occupier. You always have to think about both of these things at the same time. So the idea was to liberate Warsaw as the Germans were retreating, but before the Soviets arrived. But in the event, this worked out just as badly as it possibly could. The Germans did not withdraw as quickly as expected, and the Soviets did not arrive as quickly as expected. Instead, the Poles fought alone in Warsaw against the Germans. In the largest example of this kind of resistance, were defeated. Meanwhile, the Germans killed upwards of 100,000 civilians and took the pretext of the uprising to literally burn down the city of Warsaw. Along the way, the Polish uprising and the physical destruction of Warsaw destroyed the shelters of thousands of Jews who literally had no further place to stay in Warsaw. So Pilecki was a hero in one way in Auschwitz. He was a hero in a different way during the Warsaw Uprising. After the rising was over, like other surviving soldiers, he was taken into custody.
And Pilecki's Auschwitz heroism counted for nothing with the communists. What happened to him once the Soviets were in Poland?
Well, he was liberated in a POW camp in Germany. Then he came to Italy. So the General Anders Army, it was the Second Polish Corps there.
Polish General Anders.
Yeah, and then he returned to Poland. Well, on the one hand, he tried to organize the network of intelligence to gather intelligence information about the situation in the country and to smuggle this information to Italy. But he was not deeply engaged in any sort of military activity, I mean, a direct fight against the communists. So that was the reason why these allegations, all these accusations, raised by the communist authorities against him and his friends from the former Home Army were not true. I mean, when he was arrested in 1947, everything seems to be organized such a way to prepare a trial for him and his group in order to show them as members of the Polish reaction group who prepared the assassination of the leading officers of the Ministry of Internal Security and other leading communists in Poland, which was not true. And after spending about a year in a Polish prison of the very cruel investigations and tortures, Pilecki was finally sentenced to death and executed in 1948, not far from the Pawonsky Cemetery. Very recently, just a few days ago, his burial site was discovered, as Polish press announced a week ago.
If we can pull up the picture we have of Pilecki, you can see this is after he has been arrested, imprisoned, and obviously tortured by communist authorities before his essentially show trial and execution. Before we turn to audience questions, we have just a few minutes to talk about the report itself, which was suppressed for so many decades. What is new in this report? What is the significance of this document? And how do we read it now in a different way, having so many decades of suppression between us and when it was first written?
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, there are three extraordinary things about this document, one of which is obvious, two of which are less obvious. Let me mention the less obvious things first. The first is the circumstances under which he chose to write it. Pilecki, in effect, volunteered twice. He volunteered to go to Auschwitz in 1940, and then in 1945, in October, when he was in Italy and therefore safe, he volunteered to go back to what was becoming communist Poland. And that was a decision that actually killed him. He survived the first mission, he didn't survive the second one. And because he was perfectly aware of the risk he was taking, he then wrote out this very long document. So it was precisely his awareness that he was going back into a great risk and that he might not have another chance to write. In other words, precisely this predicament of Poland between German and Soviet power which led him to write. That's the first thing. The second thing which is extraordinary about this document is how far-sighted it was. We, of course, have in our minds the Holocaust. We look at the world and the continent and the history of the 20th century through the idea of the Holocaust. But Pilecki was observing it as it happened, and he was observing it as a Polish patriot. Remember, for him, Poland and its independence is everything. Everything that he does is based upon an extraordinary notion of Polish and personal honor. And for him, his own experience in Auschwitz is just a matter of doing what every Pole should have done. He sets a very high standard for patriotism. But even though his entire self-definition is Polish in this sense, he not only notices the Holocaust, what we now call the Holocaust, but he sees fit to write about it in such a way that every reader will understand how it's different from the suffering of Poles. In 1945, he makes clear that what's happening in 1942 to the Jewish prisoners is quite different from what was happening to the Poles, horrible though that was. And he goes to a certain effort in 1945 to make sure that any future reader of this report will understand what the Holocaust was. I think that's rather extraordinary. We, reading it in 2012, can almost take this for granted. But in 1945, he was doing something which not everyone would have done, on the contrary. And then the other thing which is obvious about this, and which Dr. Sitkiewicz is much more qualified to comment upon than I am, is the simple description of Auschwitz as a camp and as a death facility. We have few, if any, descriptions that compare to this one, and therefore it's a priceless document.
One has to think that if this document had been widely known in the immediate aftermath of the war, its significance would have been that much greater because it would have been so unusual so early.
Yes, and particularly because it refers to this period of time when we have not many sources. Namely, the organization led by Pilecki was almost was partly liquidated by the camp Gestapo, the politische Abteilung. Many members of his organization from this early period were murdered, executed under the Black Wall in Auschwitz. It was, for instance, the case of Juliusz Gilewicz, Jan Karcz, the colonels of the Polish army who were murdered in Auschwitz. We did not know much about the links between the camp and the outside world at this time because, again, the leadership, the headquarters, members and headquarters of the local home army in Oświęcim in the city were arrested in the fall of 1942 and executed again under the Black Wall in the camp. So that was why also the Pilecki testimony is extremely valuable for a better understanding of this initial period of Polish conspiracy in Auschwitz.
One of the last surviving voices. Audience questions for either of you. Someone has asked, how did Pilecki's religious faith influence his decision to enter Auschwitz? Do we know that?
We don't know much about it. I don't think so. Probably that was a question of his understanding of his moral duty as a soldier, of an officer of the army. Jan Włodarkiewicz, his commander, said that you are the right person to do so, to do such things, to go to Auschwitz to learn about the conditions there. That this was probably his motives behind it, this decision.
We have another question, which I think is also, you are probably one of the world's foremost experts on this. Could you expand on the role of corporations in the operations at Auschwitz? In terms of forced labor, corporations that profited from the availability of slave labor within the camp?
Well, additionally, the slave labor did not play an important role as in economic life of the camp. It was simply the way for murdered people. That was a case.
I'm being told you should speak a little louder.
Okay. Sorry, I got a flu. So initially, one of the major means for killing prisoners it was the work, and doesn't regardless of the kind of work the prisoners had to perform. For instance, sometimes happened that they had to carry heavy stones from one corner of the camp to the other. And only gradually, particularly after the first German defeats in the Eastern Front, and the SS tried to motivate the prisoners somehow to work harder, to make their work more profitable. So it was done in two ways. Within the structure of the concentration camp and within the structure of of the SS economical enterprises. And also there was the case of many German industrialists who decided to cooperate with concentration camp because the slave labor of the prisoners was extremely cheap. There were two reasons why the situation slightly changed in 1942, particularly in 1943, when many thousand prisoners, and in this case it were primarily Jewish prisoners, were brought from Auschwitz and transferred to many smaller sub-camps. Was almost 50 such camps organized, a whole network organized by the SS around Auschwitz. So this was the time when the prisoners were used in a more productive way for the German industry.
Thank you. Dr. Snyder, someone is asking if you would please comment on the Red Army watching Warsaw's destruction from the other side of the Vistula River. I think on context, motivations, why, how.
Yeah, that's a question that itself requires a bit of context. So from a Western point of view, we imagine that the Second World War ends when we invade Normandy and liberate France and all of this. But the war is in fact being won and decided on the Eastern Front. Down to the very end, the main enemy of the Wehrmacht is the Red Army, and the main theater of the war in Europe is Eastern Europe. And from the point of view of Poland, the country where the war started, you've moved from a situation where the Soviets and the Germans were allies, which was very bad because that began the war, destroyed your country, led to the murder of much of your educated classes, to a situation in which they're enemies, which is also very bad in different ways, because it means that the Soviets are driving German power from your country, but as they arrive in your country for the second time, remember the second time, once in 1939 and then again in 1944, as the Soviets arrive in Poland for the second time, you have to assume that they again are going to restrict Poland's sovereignty and try to place Poland under their own control, which is in fact what happens. So the Warsaw Uprising was carried out by people who understood everything that I'm saying as a very difficult attempt to squeeze between the Germans and the Soviets. If you compare it to, say, the uprising in Paris, which happened at about the same time, that could be done in the sure knowledge that the Americans were going to come and that they would be nice and you could kiss them. In Warsaw, the situation was very different. In Warsaw, you had to get the Germans out before the Red Army came. Essentially, you had to raise the flag over your own capital so that other powers might recognize you as your own government before the second occupying power came. Now, the question is about something in particular, but those larger forces, I think, are the things that are really important to understand. In my view, what happens in August and September of 1944, when the uprising is defeated, Polish civilians are killed, the city is burned to the ground, is a realization of an original German aspiration. The Germans go into this war with the idea that all of the big Slavic cities are going to be leveled, and Warsaw is one of them. And Himmler actually says as much to Hitler. Now is our opportunity to do what we've always wanted to do with Warsaw. We're going to remove this site of pestilence and filth. We're going to remove it from the face of the earth. The Soviets, I think, look upon this and don't care. They're aware that the Warsaw Uprising is going to kill many of the same people who would have resisted Soviet power. You know, all of the people who were fighting the Germans would also have fought the Soviets. And so it's, from their point of view, a rather favorable development. I don't think there was any particular plot or advance warning or any reason to think that Stalin deliberately set things up so the Red Army would stop right as the Warsaw Uprising was going on. But what we do know is that the Soviets encouraged the population of Warsaw to rise up. And then when they did rise up, not only did not help them, but deliberately prevented the British and the Americans from helping them as well. And that was one of the things which led to the horrible outcome of the destruction of the city, the defeat of the uprising, and the murder of tens of thousands of people.
So in essence, it was to the Soviets' advantage to let the Germans slaughter great portions of population who would have also proven a threat to communist rule.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's hard to exaggerate Stalin's cynicism. From the Soviet point of view, this was a kind of favorable outcome because The Poles weren't going to succeed, not without Allied help, and the Germans were going to kill Poles who would have resisted the Soviets anyway.
So again, in a way, it takes us back to one of our opening questions about Poland caught between two murderous regimes and the devastating effect on the country.
Yeah, and I mean, it's also an opportunity to mention something, right? So I've been trying very hard to construct this Polish point of view whereby German occupation is simply replaced by Soviet occupation, and that you're in this dilemma. That is the point where Polish and Jewish perspectives on the war have to change, because the arrival of the Red Army, whatever it might have meant for the future of Polish sovereignty, also meant that Jews could come out of hiding. There was no longer any danger that they were going to be killed by German power. So this is also a very powerful point where Polish and Jewish perspectives separate, and we still feel that separation.
On a different line, we have several questions, Dr. Setkevich, about how is it that Pilecki was not murdered during his captivity in Auschwitz, and several questions about just how was it possible for someone to escape. If you could talk again about some of his connections and that role, please.
Okay. In the history of the Auschwitz camp, about 1,000 people escaped. Mostly it happened in 1944, when many prisoners worked outside the main camp, when there were many sites on the factories and construction sites, and it was possible to organize to build a shelter. The prisoners, I think this would be good to stress this point, that prisoners did not escape from the camp itself. They escaped from the places when they worked around the camp somewhere. Because this system of double row of electrified fence, it was almost perfect. As far as I remember, there were only 2 cases of successful escapes of prisoners who managed to cut across the barbed wire in this way. So it was, of course, possible, but very, very dangerous. At least almost a half of prisoners who attempted to escape were captured by Germans and then mostly executed, hanged or killed under the Black Wall in the concentration camp. They were mostly Poles, which is, seems to be quite reasonable because the Polish prisoners have more chances to count on the help from the local farmers after escape. For instance, for Jews from Greece, it was who most cases did not even know the language. It was almost impossible to survive on the other side of the fences.
So even if they had defied all odds by breaking through the perimeter of the camp, where would they go? What would they do? Also, just worth reiterating that Pilecki was very strategic about it, as you said. He had a plan, and he had arranged for his work detail to take them out.
Arrangements with some people. It was a priest in the city called Alvernia, about 20 kilometers from Auschwitz, who was informed about the planned escape and so on. So he had much more chances than the ordinary prisoner to escape from Auschwitz.
A very specific question. Someone has asked when the Birkenau camp, which is the killing center, was constructed relative to the smaller original Auschwitz camp.
Well, originally the Birkenau camp was foreseen for Soviet prisoners of war. In case of Auschwitz, the capacity was estimated to be about 30,000 people. So for Birkenau, initially 100,000 prisoners, and up to 200,000. So the camp in Birkenau was to be many times bigger than Auschwitz. As I said, initially for the Soviet prisoners of war, but after the first serious German defeat in the Battle of Moscow, Himmler, in his order, on the 25th of January 1942, he explained that because now we cannot count on so many Soviet prisoners of war to be used as forced laborers, so he decided that the Soviets must be replaced with a sufficient number of Jewish prisoners who must be excluded from the general framework of a final solution. So that was the reason why finally Birkenau became the Jewish camp instead of the camp for Soviet prisoners of war. And it was, of course, many times bigger. It was finally also equipped with 4 huge gas chambers and crematoria. So it played the different functions. Well, why it was bigger? I think that because it was space enough for the construction of the new quarters, new sectors of the camp in Birkenau. Auschwitz was surrounded by the industrial areas and the rivers, so not possible in Auschwitz. In Birkenau it was possible.
Thank you. We have time, I think, just for one more question and a closing thought. Someone asked what happened to the Pilecki family. Witold Pilecki's wife and children did survive the war, and in fact, I can tell you that word of this program today has reached Poland, and just last week we received an email from a great-grandson of Pilecki saying that he had heard we were having this program, and he was very pleased to have his great-grandfather honored and recognized in this way, which meant a lot to us as well. Dr. Snyder, do you have any closing thoughts about the significance of this man and this document and talking about him today?
Well, on the one hand, we clearly are dealing with someone who was exceptional. When you ask how many people did something like this, as Dr. Setkiewicz said, the answer is one. You know, and there are similar questions where the answer is also one. If you ask how many people intentionally smuggled themselves into the Warsaw Ghetto and then made their way to the Allies and tried to inform the Allies of what happened, one person did that as well, Jan Karski. So there are these almost impossible missions which people fulfilled, but only one person did. Only one person did. And that means that we're dealing with someone who's exceptional, and we ought to remember that they were exceptional. Honor them, of course, but remember that they existed. Because the difference between 1 and 0 here is extraordinary. If no one had volunteered for Auschwitz, I think the way that we think about Auschwitz would be different. We'd know much less about it, but the way we think about people and Poles would be different. If no one had tried to tell the Allies about the Holocaust, then the way we think about the Holocaust and the Allies and Poles and human beings would be different. So it's worth remembering these individuals who did something which we would not have done, which we can be sure we would not have done, we would not have undertaken, we would not even conceived of doing, because it reminds us that these things were in fact humanly possible, at the extreme of what humans could do, but nevertheless humanly possible.
This museum, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, is charged in its mission with being a living memorial to the Holocaust, and I can think of no better story with which to inspire and remind us of the power of the individual than that which we discussed today. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Setkiewicz, for traveling from Poland, Dr. Snyder for traveling from New Haven, and all of you for joining us today. Also thank you to the Polish Embassy and Ambassador Schnepp. Thank you.